The key that opened my front door only ever lived in one place, a blue dish by my toaster. It vanished the night of my housewarming, while 40 people ate cake in my kitchen. Nobody broke a window. Nobody forced a lock. 3 weeks later, a moving truck sat in my driveway with my sister's furniture packed inside it. The key in her hand didn't turn my new deadbolt, and that single inch of metal was the only reason I still owned anything. Everyone in my family called it a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was a plan years in the making, and a missing key from a dish by my toaster was only the opening move. My name's Nora. I'm a title examiner at an escrow company, and I spend my working life making sure nobody's signature lands on a house they don't own. A skill my own family needed me to forget how to use. Renee climbed out of the truck before the engine even finished ticking. My younger sister, the one person who'd never once knocked before walking into a room. She had a box under one arm and a look on her face like she was already annoyed at whatever I was about to say. "Don't," she said, "before you start." "Start what? You're unloading a truck in my driveway." "Mom said you knew." "Mom didn't call me." Renee set the box down on the hood of the truck like she needed her hands free for the argument. Two men I didn't recognize were already working the ramp at the back, sliding out a mattress frame, a dresser, a stack of totes with her handwriting on the sides in black marker. "I texted you the date," she said. "You texted me, 'Moving soon, talk later, Renee.' That's not a date. That's a warning shot." "God, you're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you make everything sound like a deposition." I asked her, flat out, where exactly she thought she was moving to, because the house behind me had one bedroom, and it had my name on the deed, and neither of those facts had changed since the last time we spoke. "It's temporary," she said. "A few months." Mom said the address was basically already half mine anyway, so I didn't think you'd— "Basically half yours? How?" She stopped. Just for a second, but I caught it. The flicker of someone realizing they'd said a sentence they weren't supposed to say out loud yet. "Family stuff," she said. "Ask Mom." "I'm asking you." "It's not— Nora, can you just let the guys finish unloading and we'll talk inside?" "There's nothing to unload. This is my house." She looked past me at the door, and for one long moment I watched her actually try the handle, not metaphorically, her actual hand on my actual doorknob, testing it like she expected it to give. It didn't. I'd changed the locks 2 weeks earlier, after the key went missing at my own party, and I hadn't told anyone why. "It's locked," she said, like an accusation. "It's my door." "You changed the locks?" "Someone took the spare out of my kitchen the night I moved in. 40 people in my house, and one key walks out the door. You want to guess who was closest to the toaster that night? You think I stole a key. I think a key went missing, and 3 weeks later you showed up with a truck. I don't need to think very hard to connect those two things. You've always done this," Renee said. "Turned a normal favor into an investigation." "A normal favor doesn't come with movers and a couch, Renee. A normal favor is a phone call that starts with, 'Can I ask you something?' instead of a driveway full of my sister's dresser." She didn't answer that. She pulled out her phone instead, and she said, "Quiet now. Not for me. Mom, she changed the locks. Like I was a problem being reported up a chain of command instead of a person standing 3 feet away." That was the first thing I let sit without chasing it down. The sentence Renee wouldn't finish. The address that was basically half hers. A claim she'd clearly been told to believe long before she ever climbed into that truck. She left with the truck still half loaded that night, telling me I was making this into something. I went back inside and sat at my kitchen table with the blue dish in front of me, empty, and thought about how a missing key doesn't usually come with a moving truck 3 weeks later. unless somebody already had a plan for both. Monday morning, back at the office, I almost let it go. Almost. Escrow work doesn't leave much room for distraction. I process title searches, I flag liens, I make sure no one's grandmother's second husband still has a claim buried in a filing from 1987 nobody remembered to release. It's precise work. Miss one detail, and someone loses a house they thought was theirs. Which is why the alert on my own screen stopped me cold. "Hey, Priya," I said to the woman 2 desks over, my coworker, the one who'd trained me my first year and still caught things I missed. "Can you look at something for me? Not a work file. My address." She rolled her chair over without asking why, which was one of the things I loved about her. I pulled up the county recorder's portal, typed in my own street, and watched a document preview load that I had never filed, never signed, never seen. A quitclaim deed, drafted, not recorded yet, but sitting in a title company's pending queue, ready to add a second name to my property. Renee's name. That's not. Priya leaned in. Nora, that's a real form. Somebody had this drawn up. I didn't. Then who requested it? The requesting party field listed a notary's office 2 towns over. One I'd never used. One that didn't show up on any list I'd have chosen from. I called the number on the filing during my lunch break, and a receptionist answered like she'd fielded the exact question before. "I need to know who requested a deed on this address," I said, and gave her the parcel number. "I can't release requester information over the phone. I'm the property owner." "I understand that, ma'am, but the request came in through an intake form, and unless you have the confirmation number—" "I don't have a confirmation number because I didn't submit the request." There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me she'd heard that sentence before too, from someone else, in some other file, in some other year. "You'd need to file a fraud complaint with our office directly," she said, gentler now. "I can send you the form." I took the form. I didn't fill it out yet. I sat with it long enough to notice that somebody had gone to a real notary, filled out a real intake form, and needed a real signature from me to make my sister's name legal on paper. And the only reason it wasn't recorded yet was that nobody had gotten a signature that would hold up. Not yet. I drove to the notary's office 2 towns over that same afternoon, instead of going back to my desk. It was a strip mall storefront, wedged between a nail salon and a check cashing place, the kind of office that processes 50 forms a day and remembers none of them. A man in a cardigan looked up from behind the counter when I walked in. "Help you?" "I want to see the file on a quitclaim deed you drafted. This address." I slid the parcel number across the counter. He typed for a moment, frowning at his screen. "That intake came in over the phone. Someone called, gave me the details, said the owner would come in to sign within the week." "I'm the owner. I never called you." His frown deepened. "The caller had your name, your date of birth even." "Who gave you my date of birth?" "I don't keep a recording, ma'am. I just take down what's given to me and draft the form. It's not my job to verify. That's what the signing appointment is for. Nobody ever came in to sign it, so it just sat there." "Good," I said. "Keep it sitting there. If anyone calls again pretending to be me, I want you to hang up and call the county fraud line instead." He nodded slowly, like a man filing away a story he'd tell his wife that night, and I left with nothing except the confirmation that someone in my family had recited my birth date to a stranger over the phone like it was a password they'd memorized specifically for this purpose. That was the detail that sat heaviest in my chest the whole drive home, not the deed itself, but how carefully, how patiently, someone had gathered the pieces of me they needed before ever showing their hand. That was the second thing I let breathe without chasing. I didn't call Renee. I didn't call my mother. I turned over one plain, ugly fact through the rest of my shift. Whoever wanted my sister's name on my house had needed me to sign something I'd never agreed to, and the missing key from my own housewarming was the first attempt at getting close enough to try it quietly before anyone had to ask out loud. My mother called that evening, before I'd even decided how I wanted to start the conversation. Nora, your sister is very upset. Good, so am I. Don't be dramatic. She has nowhere to go, and you have 3 empty rooms. I have 1 bedroom, Mom. You know what I mean. Space. You have space, and family helps family. That's just how it's always worked. Carol, my mother, a woman who could turn any sentence into an audit of your character, had a way of saying, that's just how it's always worked, like it was scripture, instead of an excuse. I asked her, directly, why Renee thought the house was basically half hers. Silence, long enough that I checked the call hadn't dropped. She misspoke, Carol said finally. She's stressed. You know how she gets. Someone drafted a quitclaim deed with her name on my property, Mom. That's not stress. That's paperwork. I don't know anything about paperwork. I found it at work. Today, on the county system. Somebody used a notary 2 towns over to try to get my signature on a form that would have put Renee on my deed. Nora, who did that? You're twisting a family situation into something it isn't. Then tell me what it is. She didn't. She told me instead that I'd always been the difficult one, the one who made things legal instead of making things easy. And she hung up before I could ask her what, exactly, needed to be easy badly enough that someone had gone looking for a notary 2 towns away, where nobody in the family had ever set foot before. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept circling back to a phrase Carol used when I was a teenager, back when the house I grew up in nearly went to auction, and then, somehow, mysteriously didn't. We found an understanding, she used to say, an understanding with the bank, an understanding with my grandmother, an understanding with everyone who ever seemed like they should have been owed something. I'd never once heard the details, only ever the word. I called Renee first thing the next morning, before work, because some conversations shouldn't wait for a driveway or a kitchen table. You knew about the deed, I said, no greeting. What deed? Don't. I found it at the county office yesterday. My address, your name, a notary neither of us has ever used. Tell me you didn't know that existed. The line went quiet in a way that told me everything before she said a word. I knew there was paperwork, she finally said. I didn't know it needed your actual signature. I thought, Mom said you'd already agreed once you understood the whole picture. I've never agreed to anything. Nobody's shown me a whole picture. Then come see it, Renee said, this weekend. Mom wants to explain it properly, in person, not like this. Why does it need explaining if it's nothing? She didn't answer that either. She just said Saturday and hung up, and I sat there with my coffee going cold, thinking that, for the first time since the truck showed up in my driveway, somebody in my family had said a true sentence out loud. Mom wants to explain it properly, which meant, for the first time, somebody was finally admitting there was something to explain. I went to see my mother that Saturday, mostly because some conversations don't survive a phone line. Renee's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, which told me everything about how coordinated this had become. You brought backup, I said, walking in. I brought my sister, Carol said, who lives here now, temporarily, while you and I sort this out like adults. Renee was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of her, the kind with a tab labeled in Sharpie, and something about the folder made my stomach drop before I even sat down. What's that? Documents, Renee said. Mom wants you to see them before you go making accusations. I sat. I opened the folder myself, because I didn't trust either of them to hand it to me honestly, and the first page was a copy of a mortgage statement in my father's name. My father, dead 6 years, a man I'd buried without ever once hearing the word debt attached to him. Walt owed this? I said. My father, dead 6 years, and still, apparently, capable of surprising me from the grave. Your father, Carol said, and something in her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard before, took out a second loan against this house before he died. Against the house I still live in. Nobody's ever paid it off. Then why is Renee's name on a deed for my house? Because I can't refinance, Carol said. My credit's ruined. Renee's isn't much better. Yours is. Yours always has been. Adding her name to something with equity, it lets a bank see numbers that make the debt disappear on paper. On my house. Temporarily. That word keeps showing up, I said, and it keeps meaning something different every time you use it. It means until the loan is restructured. A year. Maybe less. And if I'd said no from the start, you'd have said no, Carol said. You always say no. So we hoped, that if you saw it as already decided, already moving forward, you'd sign rather than unravel something already in motion. That's why the notary tried the version with my signature already on it, I said. And I said it so plainly it took me a second to understand what I'd just put together out loud. You forged it. I filled it in the way it needed to look, Carol said. Someone was supposed to get you to actually sign a real version before any of it went anywhere official. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when someone finally says the thing everyone else has been circling for an hour. I sat there with my father's mortgage statement in one hand and my mother's confession sitting flat and undefended on the table, and the only thing I could think to ask was why me? Why my house? Why not simply tell me the truth from the start and ask? Because you'd have said no, Carol said again, softer. You've said no since you were 9 years old, and I asked you to tell your father we didn't need the money he thought we needed. You've never once let a story stay soft when the truth was easier to carry. So you decided to just take it instead. I decided to handle it the way it's always been handled. That sentence, the way it's always been handled, sat there long enough that I noticed Renee glance at our mother with something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, confusion, like she was hearing an old phrase for the first time and only now wondering where it came from. What does that even mean? Renee asked. The way it's always been handled. You say that like it's a recipe. Carol didn't answer her daughter. She looked at me instead, like I was the only one in the room who might actually understand the shape of the sentence, and for a moment I almost did. I left that afternoon without an agreement, without a resolution, and without touching the folder again. I told Renee to get her things out of my driveway by Monday. She didn't argue. My mother didn't say goodbye. What I did instead, over the next several days, was go looking, not because I needed more proof. The confession in that kitchen was proof enough for any court that would ever ask, but because the way it's always been handled isn't a phrase people invent fresh. It's a phrase people inherit. My grandmother's house had nearly gone to auction once, back when I was too young to understand why, and it hadn't. My mother used to tell that story like a fairy tale, with the scary part cut out. We found an understanding, she'd say. We made it work. Family takes care of family. I'd never once heard the actual mechanics of making it work, and something about sitting across from my mother's flat confession made me finally want to know. My Aunt Sherry, Carol's older sister, still had boxes from my grandmother's estate in her garage, and she let me come look through them on a Wednesday evening. Mostly, I think, out of the same restless need I had, the sense that a story repeating itself deserved a beginning. You're asking about the auction, Sherry said, before I'd even finished explaining why I'd called. Nobody in this family talks about the auction. Somebody should. She pulled 3 boxes down from a shelf and set them on a folding table, and we went through them together, past photographs and expired coupons and a stack of church bulletins nobody had ever thrown away. I found what I was looking for in the third box, a property record, an old one, my grandmother's house, with a second name added to the deed 11 months before the auction date that never happened. The second name wasn't a bank's, it was Carol's. My mother, 23 years old at the time, added to a title she'd never once mentioned owning any part of. "She never told you that?" Sherry asked, watching my face. "She told me we had an understanding with the bank." "There was no bank." "Not really, not the way she tells it. There was your grandmother, drowning, and Carol had just gotten her first real paycheck, and Mom, our mother, asked her to sign something temporarily, just to make the numbers work until things settled." "Did it settle?" "Carol paid on that house for 6 years before anyone ever took her name back off it. Mom never once said thank you the way you'd think she would. Just said family takes care of family, like it wasn't a debt Carol was still carrying every single month, while the rest of us went on with our lives like nothing had happened." "Did Carol ever get anything back for it? Equity, credit, anything?" "Not that I ever saw. She just absorbed it. That's the family talent, if you want to call it that. Somebody absorbs the debt, and everybody else calls it love." "Did she ever try to say no?" Sherry was quiet for a second, turning an old photograph over in her hands like the answer was written on the back of it. "Once. I remember once. She said she wanted to wait, talk to a lawyer first, make sure it wasn't going to follow her for years. Mom cried for 2 days straight. Not angry crying, the quiet kind. The kind that makes you feel like you personally broke something irreplaceable just by asking a reasonable question." Carol signed by the end of the week. "So she learned that saying no costs more than saying yes. She learned that saying no gets punished with grief you're supposed to fix. I watched her learn it. I just never thought she'd turn around and teach it to one of you." She didn't call it teaching. She called it handling things the way they've always been handled. "That's the same sentence Mom used," Sherry said, and something in her voice went flat. "Word for word. I hadn't heard it in 30 years until you just said it back to me." I sat in that garage with my grandmother's old paperwork in my lap, and for the first time, I let myself see it whole. My mother wasn't inventing a scheme out of nowhere. She was repeating the only lesson she'd ever been taught about what a house and a name and a family were actually for. Nobody had ever paid her back for the 6 years she carried. She'd folded it into herself instead, quietly, and called it love. And now she wanted the next generation to fold it in too, and call it the same thing. That didn't make what she'd done to me forgivable. It made it, for the first time, make sense. I called Renee that night. Not my mother. I told her what I'd found. The old deed. The 6 years. The debt nobody ever repaid to the woman who carried it. Renee went quiet on the phone for a long time. "She never told me any of that either," Renee finally said. "I don't think she tells anyone. I think she just expects everyone to already understand it the way she had to." "So what do we do?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not signing anything, and I know you're not moving into my house, and I know somebody in this family has to be the one who says no to a debt that isn't theirs, or it never stops. Even if it's Mom's debt, especially if it's Mom's debt. It was never mine to carry, and it was never supposed to be yours either. She just doesn't have another way of asking for help that isn't shaped like a trap." Renee didn't argue with me that night, which was its own small, strange kind of progress. She asked, before we hung up, whether I was going to report the deed, the notary, the attempt, whether Mom was going to end up in some kind of legal trouble over paperwork that never actually got recorded. I told her I hadn't decided yet, but I went to see Carol one more time before I decided anything, because there was a version of me that couldn't leave the story where it was. She let me in without a word, which told me Renee had already called ahead. I put the old property record from Sherry's garage on the table between us, the one with Carol's name on it, 23 years old, added to a house she never once mentioned owning any part of. Carol looked at it for a long moment before she said anything. "Where did you get that? Sherry's garage." "Of course. 6 years, Mom. You paid on Grandma's house for 6 years, and nobody ever thanked you for it, let alone paid you back. And instead of telling me that, instead of asking me for help honestly, you had someone recite my birth date to a stranger in a strip mall. I didn't know how else to ask. You could have just asked. You'd have said no. Maybe, but it would have been my no to give, not something you took because you assumed the answer before I ever opened my mouth." Carol's hands were flat on the table, and for once, she didn't have a ready sentence waiting. "I paid on that house for 6 years, she said finally, quiet, like she was hearing it out loud for the first time herself. And nobody in this family has ever once used the word debt when they talked about what I gave up. I didn't want Renee to carry what I carried. I just didn't know there was another way to hand her something without also handing her the weight. There is another way. It's called telling the truth and letting people choose. That's easy for you to say. You've never had to ask anyone for anything. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's true." I didn't have an answer for that one, not a clean one, not one that fit the moment the way I wanted it to. I told her I wasn't reporting the deed, not yet, but that I wasn't signing it either, not now, not ever, and that whatever debt she was carrying belonged to her and to Walt's memory, and it was not going to be quietly transferred onto me the way hers had been quietly transferred onto her. She didn't argue. She just nodded and looked, for the first time since I'd walked in, like a woman who understood exactly how much of her own life had been decided for her by someone else's silence. I called the title company back the following week and asked them to flag the pending deed permanently, to make sure it could never be recorded without a signature verified in person, notarized properly, witnessed by someone who had no reason to want it approved. That much I could do without deciding anything about my mother at all. Renee moved her things into a rental across town instead, month to month, and she still calls me on Sundays, though the calls are shorter now, more careful, like we're both relearning what an honest sentence between us is supposed to sound like. I keep the blue dish by the toaster. I filled it with a spare key again eventually, because a house shouldn't have to feel like a vault to feel like mine. But I gave that spare to Priya, not to my family. And I think everyone who mattered understood exactly what that meant without my having to explain it out loud. My mother and I haven't fully talked since that Saturday in her kitchen. She sent one text, 3 weeks after. I was only ever doing what I was taught. That's all I ever did. And I haven't answered it yet. Some nights I draft a reply and delete it before I send it, because I still don't know what an answer to a sentence like that is supposed to look like, or whether forgiving the debt she inherited means I have to forgive the one she tried to hand me. The deed still exists, somewhere in a file nobody will ever finish. My name is still the only one on my house, and somewhere across town, in a rental with month-to-month furniture, my sister is learning, slowly, the same thing I had to learn in a stranger's garage, that the story we were told about family taking care of family was never quite the whole story at all. Priya asked me last week if I was ever going to press charges, whether the notary's file was still sitting there waiting for someone to decide what it meant. I told her I didn't know, and she didn't push, which is one more reason I gave her that spare key instead of anyone who shares my blood. Renee came by on a Sunday not long ago. No truck, no boxes, just her, standing on my porch with 2 coffees like she used to before any of this started. We sat on the steps and didn't talk about the deed at all. She asked about work. I asked about her new landlord. It felt, for 20 minutes, almost like nothing had happened, and I let myself have that, even knowing it was borrowed time, even knowing the folder in my mother's kitchen drawer wasn't going anywhere on its own. Before she left, Renee turned back once, halfway down the walk, and said, "Do you think she'll ever just ask, instead of taking?" I told her I didn't know. I still don't. Some debts get paid off in a lump sum, and some just get carried, quietly, from one set of hands to the next, until somebody finally puts the folder down and says, "This one isn't mine." And I'm still not sure, watching my mother's porch light from my own driveway some nights, whether she ever will.